What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. Alright, so before I get into this video, I want to give a big shout out to the brother John Lancaster for the $5 donation via the PayPal. He says, quote, I have a political question. What do you think about Gary Chambers running for U.S. Senate in Louisiana? Well, I'm going to have to be honest with you. When I saw this question, I had no idea who he really was. I had no idea who he was. I had never heard of his name. And I look at, political threads every day, political discussions of various races throughout the country, and I had never heard this brother's name. And I'm ashamed of myself because I should have known this. I should have known who his opponent was. The only thing I've ever heard about the Louisiana Senate election from most people discussing is that it's no contest. That John Kennedy, that's the Republican name. John Kennedy has it in the bag, and his opponent is not a threat. But that's pretty much all I saw about it. I look at his situation. I look at his background. He should be a star, but he's not, because he doesn't fit the mold of the modern Democratic Party. Maybe he fits the mold of the party back in the 80s and 70s, but not today. And I keep trying to tell people listening to my videos that the Democratic Party of today is not the Democratic Party of yesteryear. If Gary Chambers Jr. was a black woman who didn't question the status quo, but was all in and completely subservient to the Democratic Party, like Stacey Abrams, he'd get a lot more traction. And if he looked like, instead of Stacey Abrams, if he was a woman, he looked like, Haley Bailey. She'd be a rising star. But he's dark skinned and he's large, so he doesn't fit into the profile. And he also, another aspect I should mention, maybe even bigger than the race thing, is that he's running a grassroots campaign, which is totally against the status quo. So he's not going to get a lot of press coverage, and he's actually for the right things. And this is when I get irritated at our communities a little bit, because we're always asking, where are the real good candidates at? And I'm looking at this guy, I'm looking at what he stands for. And I don't support everything he stands for, but more or less, if I'm a Louisiana native, I'm voting for this man. I'm going to encourage a lot of people to come out and vote for him. It's a reason why John Kennedy is running scared as far as debating this man, because John Kennedy would get his ass reamed. I don't mean in that way, but you know what I mean. He would get destroyed by Gary Chambers Jr. Just from looking at the interview on the Breakfast Club, just from reading, he knows his shit. He knows the issues inside and out. He knows the system inside and out, the layers of government, their functions, different bills that have been passed by Congress, the things they haven't passed, what he's for, what he's against. He knows his opponent's record, and they're scared to death of him. They're scared to death of this man. John Kennedy won't debate him. And you know why? Because he wants to rest on his laurels on his lead. Now, Louisiana, in the last 20 or so years, 25 years, has become a rock, ruby red Republican state. All right? It takes a certain type of Democrat to win this state. It takes a conservative white Democrat usually to win this state who has roots within the black community. That's generally the only way you can get a Democrat to even crack 45% in Louisiana. And the last time we had a Democrat carry the state in the presidential election, no surprise, Bill Clinton, 1996, who was from nearby Arkansas. I'm going to put a link to an article that I want you guys to look at. And I want you to see the racist rhetoric that this person uses when talking about Gary Chambers. I mentioned that he was arrested numerous times. But what they failed to mention is that he was arrested while protesting injustices, such as the murder of George Floyd, the murder of, what was the guy named? Alton, is it Alton? Oh, I forget his damn name. Another man who was murdered in Louisiana at the hands of police. Alton Lister? I can't remember his name. But anyway, they failed to mention that. They call him a race hustler. They call him a street hustler, the person in this video. All of the racial rhetoric is just disgusting to me. But he's none of this. He's none of this. Anytime that you talk about racial inequality in this country, and you're talking about it from, I guess, the perspective of the black community, and you're not belittling the black community, but you're talking about how things aren't fair, which most white people know is true, you have these people that will call you a race hustler. But it's perfectly okay for Candace Owens and Jason Whitlock and Larry Elder and all of those bums. It's perfectly okay for them to belittle black people and say, hey, it's black people's fault they're in the position they're in. White people, we should be more like white people, blah, blah, blah. When you black shame, that's just telling like it is. That's not race hustling. When they race hustle more than anybody. Jason Whitlock right now is the biggest race hustler on YouTube. Every video that he does usually revolves around him shitting on someone black. And he's going to do it because 80 to 85 to 90% of black people, depending upon what state or what poll you're looking at, vote Democratic still, right? Even though it's dropping. So it's just financially, rewarding to do what Jason Whitlock does, but it is draining his soul to do what he does. But he doesn't have one. He doesn't care. I don't want to make this about him, but let me get back to the point. From reading about Gary Chambers Jr., he had, I wouldn't say a bad upbringing. His mother committed suicide when he was only an infant. He was raised by an aunt and uncle for much of his younger years. His father had an addiction to alcohol, which he didn't overcome until Gary was about a teenager. He lived with his father. I think he moved to Florida and graduated from high school in Florida, moved back to Louisiana, lived with his grandparents. And ultimately, he became a manager at a Home Depot that reopened shortly after Hurricane Katrina occurred. And later on in his life, he became an ordained minister. But the article will tell you that he's a race hustler and a pimp and all these derogatory racial epithets aimed at black people, especially black men. He's a progressive, which, you know, me politically, I'm kind of moderate to conservative, but I do support some progressive measures. And I would look at it like this. On the whole, despite any issues that I may disagree with him, on the whole, if I was in Louisiana, I'd vote for him because he's definitely for the people. He's definitely for the people. He supports the Green New Deal, which basically is an adaptation of the things that FDR was for, but except modernizing it by talking about the climate issues and infrastructure issues and things of that nature. Some of the modern issues that we have today. He's for that. He believes that we should improve the quality of Medicaid and Medicare by reducing spending as far as the defense budget. I don't have a problem with that, and I'll tell you why. Because if you look at how much we spend on defense as opposed to Medicaid and Medicare, these things become more important to you as you get older. And you would think in theory that older people would be voting in droves for this guy, but, they can't get over certain bullshit. He's for a minimum wage of $15 or more. He believes in a bill, a massive bill that would improve the infrastructure of the United States, which is long overdue. A lot of the roads in the United States have not been updated since the 50s. But this infrastructure bill would also create jobs, labor jobs, which would greatly benefit people who are unskilled laborers, greatly benefit people who tend to be poor and tend to be black. Right? But, I look at what he's for and I see the points he makes, but he also talks about some of it is on us. We have to educate ourselves about how government works. Now, he's pointed out the bullshit that they're on, but he says, look, we got to understand how government works. He says sometimes people will go to him and say, look, why can't you do this and this? And look, will you do this and this if you were elected to the Senate? He said, well, look, that's a job that you should talk to your local congressman about, or your councilman, or school board member. I have no control over that. And he said that we need to educate ourselves about the layers of government. And not just black people, but as a whole. Americans are slipping when it comes to how we are educated on how the layers of government work. So I will say this about him. I don't think he's going to be elected senator. I don't think he's going to be elected senator. But if this was a competition of wits, if this was a challenge of who is the best administrator, it'd be hands down Chambers over Kennedy. I'll tell you one thing. I saw that John Kennedy is ducking him as far as the debates. And that's because he wants to rest on his laurels and skate to November with a 50+% lead so he doesn't have to deal with a runoff. Because according to the laws in Louisiana, as far as the Senate election goes, U.S. Senate, if the top candidate doesn't get 50% of the vote, there's an automatic runoff between the top two candidates. And John Kennedy doesn't want that. So he doesn't want any exposure to Gary Chambers, because all it's going to do is more than likely just give Gary Chambers more exposure, and it may expose John Kennedy as not being as in the know about a lot of stuff. As a matter of fact, more and more Senate politicians in general, more and more politicians I've read are ducking debates because they don't want to be exposed for the nimrods that they are, a lot of them. Or they're ducking debates because they don't want to give their opponent that type of exposure, which to me is indicative of the fact that a lot of people that we have in power really don't belong there. A lot of these people, I believe, are in Congress because they are patsies. They will do whatever the party wants them, whatever the donors want, and that doesn't make them good leaders. It just makes them good hype men or hype women. And someone like Gary Chambers, who I also have to mention is for the decriminalization of marijuana, which is something I'm for. Another reason why he doesn't get exposure isn't just because he's a black man and he's not part of the modern Democratic Party as far as fit. But it's also because he's running a grassroots campaign. He's not part of the establishment. He's not being told what to say. He's not being controlled by money. So that's why you also aren't hearing anything about him. So, to me, I think Louisiana should go out on November, I believe it's the 8th or the 6th. You know what? When the hell is election day? Someone's telling me it's the 8th. Let me see. Yep. November the 8th. If you live in Louisiana, go out and vote for Gary Chambers Jr. for Senate. Create the upset. Vote for Gary Chambers Jr. Don't just take my word for it. Look into his record. Look to see what he stands for. He's 37 years old. I believe that he really wants to change things. And I think he wants to upset the apple cart of the Democratic Party. And he also, of course, wants to create real change for citizens, ordinary citizens in the state of Louisiana. And he'd be a breath of fresh air. Louisiana used to have a lot of candidates who, Louisiana used to have a streak of populism. But that has died out a lot in the last 15 to 20 years. Louisiana also, even though Louisiana was part of the Confederacy and, of course, part of Jim Crow, economically, Louisiana had a lot of liberals, which was crazy because Huey Long, who was basically the dictator of Louisiana until he was assassinated in September of 1935, right? Huey Long was economically a liberal. And the crazy thing about it, you had a lot of people in the state of Louisiana who were culturally conservative, white supremacists. But economically, they were liberal. And that's something that a lot of people don't know. Like, a lot of times, you can be culturally conservative or even culturally liberal and still be a white supremacist. It's not so... It's not as monolithic as you would think in the South as far as how people vote back then, even though we were shut out completely in the process. They didn't all agree on all issues, but they did agree on one thing, and that's to put their collective foot on our necks. The difference is a lot of those people went on to become Republicans, but a lot of them also went on to become Democrats. So anyway, that's all I got to say about it. Tell me what you guys think.